Thank you. Okay, I think it is a very difficult time because all of us just finished our lunch. But I do believe that you will still be interested in listening to the presentations of the both speakers. Yeah? And the first speakers will be Dr. Alan Ada Lachica, Vice President for the Academic Affairs and Dean of Students of National Defense College of the Philippines. So, I mean, the speakers will present their views on maritime connectivity and regional stability in Southeast Asia. So, I think this is just the following the previous sessions or sessions one in the morning. So, please, Dr. Alan Ada Lachica from the Philippines to present his views. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I was told that we were given only 20 minutes to speak, and we're supposed to start at 1 o'clock, and now it's 1:23, so maybe I just have a couple of minutes to speak. I did not prepare any script, because as a professor, I am used to giving lectures using the PowerPoint. So allow me to do that, and I will try to be very concise, especially on the things that I will be speaking before you today. But before I start, I would like to emphasize that the views and the thoughts that I will be expounding today are my personal views and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of the National Defense College of the Philippines, nor the government of the Republic of the Philippines. I entitled my talk today about geopolitics of the South China Sea dispute and its focus on the Philippine perspective. Next slide. This is a brief outline of my presentation. Next slide. The South China Sea, which is part of the Great Pacific Ocean, the ocean which is supposed to be a body of water for peace, has now become the center in nexus of unpredictability in terms of security in the Indo-Pacific. A security challenge which affects not just the Northeast Asia, but also the Southeast Asia, and to a greater extent, the world. The South China Sea is strategically important for Northeast and Southeast Asia for several important reasons. According to a study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, 3.4 trillion of goods pass the South China Sea annually. 20%, that represents 21% of the world trade, 40% of China's trade, 20% of Japan's trade, and not only that, 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas is believed to be sitting under the South China Sea with 11 billion barrels of oil. And not just for the economic aspect, the importance of the South China Sea, it's also its geostrategic location for great powers' military projection. I'm sorry, it should have been A2AD or anti-access area denial. Geostrategically, when war will break out in the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea will play a very important role. The Korean Peninsula, the Senkaku dispute in Japan. When we talk about the South China Sea, it's really very much interconnected to the other equally important, the Malacca Strait. As I was talking with the distinguished gentleman, general from Singapore a while ago, when we talk about conflict in the South China Sea, it should be interrelated with the peace and stability as well of the Malacca Strait. Because one could be, if conflict affects the other, it would also affect the other body of water. So the potential for its huge impact cannot be overstated. Next slide, please. The South China Sea dispute is a convergence of clashing national interests among the claimant states. These national interests are projected through sovereignty and territorial claims on the different features in the area. Two divisions in the South China Sea, the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands, the two major group of islands. The Paracel Islands being contested by China, Vietnam, and Taiwan, and the Spratly Islands by the other claimants, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, and Taiwan, and as well as China. It has become a very serious threat, according to many geopolitical analysts and security experts, that it is a big challenge and a threat to the peace and stability of the Indo-Pacific region. And the potential for armed clash between the US and China grows every day. In fact, some of the writers and scholars would call it as a geopolitical time bomb, ready to explode at any given moment. Perhaps one thing that is very clear when it comes to the dispute and the conflict in the South China Sea, and it is the aggressive behavior of China in pursuing its maritime claims, which has been a cause of serious concerns for the other claimants in the region. The Chinese claim is primarily pursued in four strategies: massive reclamation and building of artificial islands. According to data by the US Department of Defense, between 2013 and 2015, 3,000 acres of land were reclaimed by China, while only 172 acres were reclaimed by the other claimants in the last 40 years. 95% of all reclaimed activities in the South China Sea are being done by China. Please go back to the previous slide. China is also utilize also the cabbage strategy and the salami slicing. Selective application of international law. We've read that in the papers. We've known that China would constantly, in the case of the Philippines, would constantly harass Philippine Coast Guard, Philippine fishing boats, and then when confronted, China would claim it's just protecting its sovereignty according to the UNCLOS. China is also challenging the military presence of the US and other powers in the area. So these four strategies are incorporated into China's course of action in the South China Sea. The South China Sea has been elevated to the level of being a core territory by Beijing. It's indispensable for China's economic growth, and it's critical for the defense of its southern territories. Next slide, please. So we can see here, as depicted in this cartoon, how massive China has been claiming the entire South China Sea. The next slide. Building a rules-based maritime order in the South China Sea is indispensable for the security and economic prosperity in the region. Allow me to discuss three distinct regimes that could contribute to the rules-based maritime order. Next. The first one that I would like to talk about is the 2016 arbitral ruling. The Permanent Court of Arbitration, in the case of the Philippines versus China, made the following rulings in July 2016, which I'm pretty much sure most of us in this room knew about it. In a gist, the ruling of the PCA says, number one, China's expansive claim with a 9-dash line in the South China Sea is invalid. The maritime features are not islands, but rocks and low tide elevations. Hence, they do not generate territorial sea or exclusive economic zone. Submerged features do not generate territorial seas. Low tide elevations cannot be considered as lands and have no territorial sea entitlement nor EEZ. The altered form or modification of any maritime and geographic feature, the island building, reclaimed islands made by China, would not be conferred with legal status. And China's maritime activities has harmed the marine environment. Supposedly, This is the infamous China's 9-dash line, which others would call as the cow's tongue. But for many Filipinos, we call it the devil's tongue. It covers 80% of the South China Sea. So what is the significance of the 2016 arbitral ruling? Next slide. Number one, it invalidated excessive maritime claims. For example, China's 9-dash line. It settles the question of China's historic rights in the South China Sea under the UNCLOS. Historic rights are extinguished by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. No state, coastal state, could just open their cabinet drawers and pull out some old maps and say, oh, our ancestors mentioned this area, so this is ours. If that would be the case, then that would defeat the very purpose of the UNCLOS. Another significance of the 2016 arbitral ruling is that it preserves the EEZ regime, meaning to say, states could not just create and build islands and then claim that they could generate exclusive economic zone. Another significance of the 2016 arbitral ruling is that it provided a mechanism for peaceful settlement of maritime disputes under UNCLOS. And that's what precisely the Philippines did when we submitted it to the international arbitration. And it offered protection for small powers against big powers' encroachment. The PCA ruling is a representation of the majesty of international law, especially for small powers. With this victory that we have, what is the Philippine strategy using this arbitral ruling? Number one, reiterate arbitral ruling in public pronouncements and international fora, creating public awareness domestically and internationally about what transpired, what is ours, and what has been supplied by the international law, which specifically is the UNCLOS. 2022, the current president said, as you can read it, that we will use the arbitral ruling to assert our territorial rights. It's not a claim. It's already our territorial right, and that is what the arbitral ruling can do to help. The next one. Former President Rodrigo Duterte. I would just like to read a part of his speech before the UN General Assembly. The award is now part of international law, beyond compromise and beyond the reach of passing governments to dilute, diminish, or abandon. Number two, galvanize support from the international community. More and more countries have been voicing support for the decision of the PCA in support of the UNCLOS. Recently, the G7 declared support for the South China Sea arbitral ruling, as well as key powers in the region, Australia and Japan as well. I would just like to show a comparison. The statements made, official statements made by different ASEAN countries when the PSA ruling came out. You can see it. What I found are the official statements of Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Singapore, and Vietnam. The next one, assert sovereignty and territory based on the PCA ruling. Since 2020, the Philippines has filed 405 diplomatic protests against China because of its incursion into our territories. In 2022 alone, the Philippines filed 189 diplomatic protests. according to President Marcos, the position that the Philippines takes is that we have no territorial conflict with China. What we have is China claiming the territory that belongs to the Philippines. The next slide. The Philippine Armed Forces, to the Philippine Navy, and also the Philippine Coast Guard have been mandated to constantly increase patrolling our territorial waters to defend our sovereignty. The next regime that I would like to talk is about the freedom of navigation. Freedom of navigation lies at the heart of the UNCLOS. It is the very foundation of international maritime travel for all ships and for all countries. It is indispensable for global trade and for peace and security. It is a very important principle in international law, the regime of innocent passage, where ships can traverse territorial seas of coastal states, transit passage through straits, and the archipelagic sea lanes passage for archipelagic states like the Philippines and Indonesia. For Philippines and Indonesia, archipelagic sea lanes passage is a balance between upholding the rights of other countries for unhampered travel in our archipelagic waters, but at the same time, to protect our national security and sovereignty. Freedom of navigation is so important in the South China Sea issue because as what I have shown earlier, the very important role that the South China Sea has been playing in the global trade. In fact, according to the US study by the US National Bureau of Economic Research in 2020, should there be a blockade of the South China Sea, or let's say because of military conflict, and there would be a freeze of international shipping, Singapore's trade would fall by 22%. Hong Kong, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia would experience 10 to 15% drop on its trade or total trade. The freedom of navigation is so important for ASEAN that in very important declarations or public statements and public documents, this has been mentioned from 1996 to the 2002 declaration to the 2017 joint communique, and even recently, the chairman's statement of the 42nd ASEAN Summit. All this have emphasized the importance of the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Next slide, please. And the next. And the last one, the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. The COC is envisioned to provide a framework in which countries in the region could conduct maritime activities based on common agreed rules. I will show you the timeline of the COC. From 1992 until up to the present. For 21 years, we have been dreaming, we have been talking, we have been negotiating of a code of conduct in the South China Sea. If you would ask me, when can we have it? Your guess is as good as mine. From the 1992 ASEAN Declaration on the South China Sea, significant events have happened. 2018, 2017, the framework of the Code of Conduct for the South China Sea starts the process of between China and ASEAN to come together and lay down the rules on what should constitute a code of conduct. What is also significant is the SDNT, or the Single Draft Negotiating Text, approved in 2018. Why is it important to have a COC? It would reduce tensions in the South China Sea. It would limit the possibility of armed conflict. it would constrain the aggressive behavior of parties, and it would provide a framework for maritime cooperation and development. By having an agreed set of rules, tensions could be managed, since parties to the COC would be properly informed of the expected behavior and permitted activities. By having a clear set of expectations, military activities that are allowed would be clearly spelled out as well. A COC which contains dispute settlement mechanisms and which identifies acceptable behavior would deter claimant state to pursue aggressive behaviors. However, the path towards having an acceptable COC is being hampered by different problems. Number one, the geographical coverage of the COC. Would it include the whole of South China Sea? Would it only focus on the Paracel Islands and the Spratly Islands? That's very crucial. And because China's insistence that everything would start to include the 9-line areas of which it is contesting. And for ASEAN, it is a no-starter. Another problem is the nature of the COC. Would it be legally binding for all parties? Because if it's legally binding, there might be some aversion on that, especially on the part of China. The means of settling disputes. Would it be an arbitration? As what you might have known, based on the PCA experience, China doesn't want third-party arbitration to any conflict in the South China Sea between any rival claimant. Another thing is the parties included in the COC. Would it be exclusive for ASEAN and China, or would it also recognize the rights of the other powers as well? Perhaps one sticking issue during the negotiations, or in the current negotiations for the adoption of a COC, especially as what was contained in the single draft negotiating treaty, is one of the demands of China, which says that parties shall not hold joint military exercises with countries from outside the region unless the parties concerned are given prior notification and poses no objection. In effect, this is a veto by China for ASEAN member states' military exercises with the US and other countries. In my perspective, how should a final COC would look like? Number one, specific area or scope of coverage must be made clear. It should be legally binding for all parties. Unlike the DOC in 2002, that is merely a general statement on this, certain expectations and principles. But the DOC, or the COC, should be different from the COC. It should be legally binding for all parties. It should have a clear guidelines on the conduct of maritime activities, the do's and don'ts. It should provide mechanism for dispute settlement, acceptable rules on the extraction and development of maritime resources, and it should be non-restrictive to outside powers. Amidst this question of the conflict in the South China Sea, one thing that would come to mind is ASEAN centrality. ASEAN should play a central role in the South China Sea issue. The conflict in the South China Sea is one of the greatest, if not the greatest challenge that contemporary ASEAN is confronting, especially on its 56-year history. ASEAN cannot afford to lose its centrality in creating a peaceful and stable South China Sea. Yet, the path towards ASEAN unity in this issue remains a daunting task considering the divergent interests of ASEAN member states. It is imperative that ASEAN must find a way to project a united stand against China. A united stand, not against China. I would like to emphasize that again. It is imperative that ASEAN must find a way to project a united stand, not against China or any particular country, but a united stand for the rule of law and for the establishment of a rules-based order in the South China Sea. The different ASEAN-led mechanisms must be strengthened, including the ARF, the ASEAN Plus 3, the EAS, and the ADMM+. The adoption of an acceptable COC should be of primary importance to ASEAN. The fast-evolving geopolitical realities in the South China Sea calls for ASEAN to exercise careful diplomatic balancing, the intensifying strategic rivalry between the US and China. ASEAN centrality is crucial because it gives ASEAN the power to control and set the region's agenda. It enhances the reputation of ASEAN. It burnishes ASEAN's credibility to coordinate and lead. And ASEAN's centrality prevents outside powers to manipulate or hijack ASEAN programs and initiatives. The next slide. To conclude, the territorial disputes in the South China Sea continue to evolve on its complexity, which created an environment of security challenges and even tension due to unresolved competing territorial claims. However, competing states have two choices to make: a path to resolving peacefully the maritime disputes, or playing hardball politics by resorting to power buildup and direct confrontation. The establishment of a rules-based order in the South China Sea must be the goal of the disputing states in order to reduce tension by conforming to the agreed rules and norms. The Philippines sees a stable South China Sea as a core component of a peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. I would like to end this presentation by quoting the statement of the Philippine President during the 42nd ASEAN Summit in Indonesia, when he said, "We must ensure that the South China Sea remains a sea of peace, a sea of security and stability and of prosperity. With the UNCLOS and international law as our basis, the South China Sea will be a nexus of vibrant economic engagements and interactions, not an epicenter of armed conflict or geopolitical maneuverings." That concludes my presentation. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Lachica. I think this is very interesting speech related to the ASEAN centrality in settling the dispute in South China Sea, in particularly to settle the territorial boundary disputes between China and other ASEAN countries, except Indonesia, I think. Okay, the second speaker, please, Brigadier General Tiong Keat, Commandant of the Singapore Armed Forces Training Institute. So, please.
Yeah, excuse me. Very good afternoon to Bapak Andi Wijanto, Governor of Lemhanas, distinguished participants of the 7th Jakarta Geopolitical Forum, ladies and gentlemen. Before I begin, I want to express my deepest appreciation to Bapak Andi for inviting me to speak today. It is really a privilege and a humbling experience to be able to speak and exchange views with all the bright minds at this forum and discuss key geopolitical issues that impact our region. Maritime connectivity and regional stability are issues that are close to the heart of many people in our region, especially because they are closely intertwined. The maritime trade routes that traverse Southeast Asia waters are increasingly contested, and we have spoken a lot about the South China Sea. Just now, Dr. Allen had a set of statistics that shows the importance of South China Sea. I would like to point out $3.4 trillion of trade that passes through the South China Sea every year. $3.4 trillion, that is the combined GDP of all the Southeast Asian nations. Hence, in my mind, we cannot overstate the need to ensure stability and security of these trade routes. Unfortunately, the South China Sea has become a focal point for the interplay of global and regional tensions. At the strategic level, the US and China are competing for influence in the Asia-Pacific region. They hold very different strategic perspectives of and outlook for the region. I think this stark contrast was manifested at the recently concluded Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin made reference to the numerous partnerships established in the region, such as the Quad and those with ASEAN. And he said, I quote, "The US will support allies and partners as they defend themselves against coercion and bullying." On the other hand, Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu, he said, and I quote, "Attempts to push for NATO-like alliances in the Asia-Pacific is a way of kidnapping regional countries and exaggerating conflicts and confrontations." He added that a Cold War mentality is now resurgent, greatly increasing the security risk. At the regional maritime front, this competition is perhaps most apparent in the South China Sea, where both the US and China have a regular military presence. The Chinese have established forward bases in the Spratleys and the Paracel Islands with intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, and area denial capabilities. The US continues to conduct freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs in short, and her ships have often sailed within 12 nautical miles of some Chinese-claimed islands. At times, ships from both navies were involved in close encounters. I'm sure many remember what happened in 2018 when the USS Decatur had a close encounter with a Chinese warship during her FONOPs. 2 months ago, USS Milius sailed within 12 nautical miles of Mischief Reef in the Spratleys as part of another FONOPs, which the Chinese characterized as an illegal intrusion into China's waters. What appears more worrying to me are the limited lines of communications between both countries. Again, at the recent Shangri-La Dialogue, both Secretary Austin and Minister Lee did not manage to meet bilaterally. They only had a handshake. You can either see as a glass half full or a glass half empty. But given the close proximity that both nations are operating in the South China Sea, the risk of miscalculation is very high. Hence, it is very important for them to establish communication channels that will allow them to speak freely and de-escalate tensions when required. The US-China dynamics aside, the stability and security of the South China Sea are further complicated by complex territorial and maritime claims. On record, competing and overlapping claims by China, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam have led to a complex web of assertions by the various parties through military, legal, and other means. Some of these claims have been brought to arbitration, like what Dr. Allen spoke about earlier, when the case was brought to the PCA by the Philippines against China. Countries have also been observed to use non-military levers to advance their interests, including the involvement of coast guards and maritime law enforcement agencies. For example, in 2019, Vietnam introduced legislation that broadened her coast guard's mandate to operate beyond her EEZ. In 2021, 2 years ago, China enacted the China Coast Guard Law in January and a revised maritime traffic safety law in September, which provided their maritime forces with greater legal enforcement powers. All these actions translate to coast guards in the region playing a larger role in contestation at sea. The role of coast guards is not an entirely new phenomenon. Back in 2014, a Chinese deep-sea oil drilling rig and its escorts entered disputed waters in the South China Sea. In response, Vietnam dispatched vessels from her coast guard and fisheries resource surveillance to intercept the Chinese. The ships from both countries engaged in a series of skirmishes at sea, and this is again a timely reminder of the stakes at hand and the risk of miscalculation and escalation even when naval vessels are not involved. Now, at this point, I should clarify that I have highlighted all these developments not to judge or to take sides, but to make an unequivocal point that tensions in the region have risen steadily over the years. I recall as an army officer, when I first heard the term maritime security in early 2000s, we were talking about piracy and terrorism in the Straits of Malacca. 20 years later, we are talking about tensions and the possibility of war in the South China Sea. That's how much tensions have risen in our region. We need to recognize the risk and take concrete measures to lower the temperature, lest we sleepwalk into conflict. Now, taken together, the US-China competition and competing claims in the South China Sea are posing complex challenges to regional maritime security. In fact, in the words of systems thinking, I think it has become a wicked problem. More than ever, collaborative efforts are needed to maintain stability and ensure that maritime trade and connectivity can continue unabated. So, given the complexities of the wicked problem in the South China Sea, I think it will be presumptuous for anyone to believe that there is a magic set of solutions that can solve the problem overnight. Nevertheless, I will suggest 3 lines of effort to mitigate the risk of escalation and promote de-escalation. First, dialogue and collaboration remain key. We have spoken a lot this morning about ASEAN centrality, and I believe that ASEAN, given our centrality, provides multiple avenues for countries to pursue such dialogues and collaboration. ASEAN-led platforms such as the various ADMM Plus exercises have good traction with multiple stakeholders. These frameworks provide constructive dialogue as well as practical cooperation with extra-regional partners, including China and the US. Multilateral exercises also provide good opportunities for exchanges and dialogues. One such example is the recently conducted Navy multilateral exercise Komodo, which was hosted by the Indonesian Navy and which brought the navies from the US and China together. Collaboration may not always take the form of large-scale exercises. Every small effort counts. Every small confidence-building measure counts, especially if we can focus on finding win-win solutions to build the trust and to keep the lines of communications open. Now, Singapore's Information Fusion Center is one such example. The close collaboration in dealing with transnational threats of piracy and terrorism was exemplified during the 8th Maritime Information Sharing Exercise, when representatives from 29 nations came together to strengthen cooperation against maritime security threats. I think efforts along this vein should be encouraged. Second, I believe we should press on with our efforts to develop formal guidelines for interactions at sea. The ADMM Expert Working Group on Maritime Security seeks to promote the practice of confidence building and measures to reduce the risk of miscalculation, such as through the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, or CUES in short. Now, I note that CUES has been adopted by all the ADMM Plus navies and was most recently employed by the ASEAN member states navies and the Indian Navy in May 2013 during the inaugural ASEAN-India Maritime Exercise. Looking ahead, ASEAN must continue to work with China towards an effective and substantive code of conduct in the South China Sea that is in accordance with universally recognized principles of international law, including the 1982 UNCLOS. And the code of conduct must safeguard the rights and interests of all parties in the South China Sea. I am very heartened to note that Indonesia, as the ASEAN chair, is proposing to conduct and conclude the negotiations within a 3-year time frame. It has been more than 30 years in the making. I'm sure many of us hope that we can make substantive progress in drafting the code of conduct. Third, we need to expand our existing engagement to include all the key maritime stakeholders. Now, I spoke earlier about the increasing roles that are played by the Coast Guards and the maritime law enforcement agencies in the region. To that end, they must be included as part of engagement efforts to promote regional stability. One such avenue can be through multilateral fora. For example, at the recently concluded 8th International Maritime Security Conference, there was a dedicated session that was held for Coast Guard representation and discussion. Another area that we can look at is to expand CUES, which today applies only to the ASEAN navies, but we can expand CUES to include the Coast Guards and the maritime law enforcement agencies. Ultimately, beyond enhancing dialogue and means for cooperation, I believe that upholding and adherence to a rules-based international order is key to maintaining security and stability in the region. UNCLOS represents that. Now, UNCLOS was envisioned and developed at a time where many coastal states were making increasingly extensive claims to unilaterally expand their jurisdiction and rights to exploit the ocean's resources. For more than 4 decades, UNCLOS has brought order and predictability to our waters. In the words of Bapak Andy this morning, constructive joint solutions. UNCLOS has led to constructive joint solutions. So it will do us well to continue to uphold a rules-based order so that we can avoid a situation where might is right and we can continue to preserve the stability and prosperity in our region. Now, I will acknowledge that there will be skeptics who will question the relevance of continued dialogues and collaboration. After all, we have spent more than 30 years trying to come up with a code of conduct. We have spent many years trying to resolve the South China Sea tensions through dialogue. So, what more can dialogues do? Well, certainly I don't think that the discussions will be easy, but we have to ask ourselves, do we have a better alternative? besides dialogue, what else do we want to do? Do we want to raise the probability of war and conflict in the region? Or we want to continue to give peace and diplomacy every chance to succeed? And it is my belief that if all the countries involved are committed to managing the disputes in a peaceful manner, we will definitely be able to find a solution. And in fact, I think that Indonesia and Singapore are a shining example of how we can resolve our differences peacefully when we are able to focus on our common interests over the longer term. I think between both countries, our recent agreements on long-standing bilateral issues in airspace management, defense cooperation, and extradition of fugitives bear testament to the old adage that if there is a will, there is a way. So in closing, I believe we can all agree here that the stakes at hand are extremely high. The relative peace and security in our region over the past 6 decades have allowed all of our countries to prosper. And we owe it to our future generations as leaders to maintain this peaceful and prosperous growth trajectory. The cost of war in our region will be catastrophic, possibly existential for some countries. That key parties today are even contemplating the possibilities of conflict in our region is a sharp reminder, a stark reminder, that we need to redouble our efforts in diplomacy and confidence building to preserve the stability and security in our region. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigadier Tan. This is also a very interesting speech, yeah. How ASEAN, in particular Indonesia and Singapore, as working together, yeah, to prevent conflict related to South China Sea, and how we can make the future generations will see that the area in South China Sea is a peaceful area, yeah, and also prosperous and also secure, not only to our generations but also for the next generations, yeah, because it is very important, yeah. But the problem is until now, yeah, we know that China still keep her unilateral claims, yeah, in South China Sea, and also make her own laws and also regulations, yeah, related to the South China Sea, yeah? Not only related to the freedom of navigations, but also related to the the navigations in that area, yeah. That's why sometimes there has been a problem or conflict, yeah, between China and the U.S. and also Vietnam and the Philippines as well, yeah, related to the South China Sea. Yeah. Okay, the last speaker will be Mr. Hoang from he is actually a research officer of the East Sea Institute, Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam. So, please, Mr. Dong.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, moderators. Thank you, distinguished guests. First of all, I would just like to say thank you to Lemanas for all of your hard work and putting this event together so marvelously and inviting us up here to share our views and also giving me an opportunity to sit down and talk to some of the very well-known prominent experts whose work that I really admire. So my topic is a little bit about the connectivity size among the ASEAN members. And the connectivity part that I would like to focus on is the informational connectivities. I would also follow Ambassador Suka's approach in session 1, which is I'm going to just have 3 points. I'm going to try and finish it quickly so that I can hear more from you guys. So the first point is that The first point is that why do we have to care about informational capacity, informational connectivities, or in other words, some people would call MDA, right? And then the second point is about what are some of the MDA initiatives that are currently being offered to ASEAN countries, and what are the potential hindrance limits of these initiatives or potential contributions of these initiatives to the ASEANs. And then the last point would be about the suggestions, of course, the way forward, how ASEAN should approach those MDA or informational connectivity initiatives. So why do we have to care about it? One of the reasons why is that a lot of actors, a lot of ASEAN partners have been putting out MDA initiative, either on their own or either with a multilateral group. And the most popular one I would like to name is the EU Primario program. So this program has been moved into phase 2, specifically targeting Asia-Pacific country, and the EU has reached out to some of the ASEAN members about promoting the program, especially a software called IORIS, which is the centerpiece of that program, for ASEAN country to monitor what is going on the surface at seas. And the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, we have all been reached out by the EU. And another program which is gaining in popularity recently is the Quad IPMDA, which has been announced last year at the Quad Summit. The purpose is somewhat similar. They also aims at detecting dark vessels, which is shipping vessels that turned off their AIS. And they also aim to reach out to ASEAN members, and it has been demonstrated at last year Keat exercise in Singapore. But they are not the only one. Apart from them, there are also Canada Indo-Pacific Strategies, which was very freshly released. There was a part of it that mentioned specifically that Canada will also try to promote a program called Dark Vessel Detection Program in the Pacific. Japan has been doing similar works, and I would also like to include India with its Indo-Pacific Ocean Initiative, in which 2 pillars are maritime and connectivities, and because India has fusion centers as well, similar to Singapore. So I would also see the potentials of MDA being a part of IPOI in their engagement with the ASEAN. So when you have a lot knocking at your door, a lot of offers, what should you do, right? I feel like the first thing that you should do is to examine it, to examine the nature, the features, right, of such initiative, and then you can see what the implications of such features are. So the most common characteristics among all of those initiatives are that they are, first of all revolving around one particular web-based tool. So for IPMDA, it would be CVisions, and for Primario, as I said, it would be IORIS, right? And then the others one also have their separate web-based tool. And then the second part is that they are more than just AIS. So AIS signals, there are a lot of limits to it. It can be manipulated, it could be fabricated, it could be turned off. But these program aims at integrating new database and different sources of data apart from AIS, such as radio frequency, such as optical, such as sensor technologies, even in the future AI, so that when a vessel's turned off their AIS, they can still be detected. And of course, they usually aim at IUUs, dark vessel phishings. So what are the implications? So these are my own observations coming from my own research and also from my dialogue with partners. I felt like that there could be some certain concern for ASEAN members when being approached with the invitation to join such initiative. The first one is that it's usually thought, MDA is usually thought as a Western concept. Actually, just yesterday, I talked to somebody in the lobby, and they told me that MDA to them is a US coined concept, which is not completely wrong, because the US under the Bush administrations in the post 9/11 context did put forward the use of MDA. There are other concerns, including maybe joining an MDA initiative could be seen as taking side, picking one over another. There are also concerns about integrating new technologies into your domestic system and how evasive such new technology could be. Maybe your sovereignty in cyberspace could be detrimentally affected somehow. And then there's also concerns about how well integrated the new software could be put into the existing hardware, especially when your military hardware is from one source of origins and the software is from another. So yeah, these are very legitimate, very not unfounded concern, but personally, I would feel like these concerns do not reflect the comprehensive pictures. So what it does not reflect is that actually MDA, regardless of where it comes from, the terminologies has been adopted by IMO, by the African Union, and even ASEAN countries. Even the ASEAN has used this term officially in a program within ADMM, or within our exercises with partners. It's a part of our regular activity agenda already. And MDA, there are people thinking that MDA could be intelligence sharing, which is sensitive. But truth be told, a lot of intelligence sources nowadays come from open and commercial sources. I remember reading one specific statistic that said 80% of intelligence currently is open source. So the sensitivity around the word intelligence or information sharing, I think, should also be readjusted. And then because all of the programs that I named above are more on a web-based tool, which means you could access them via a website, meaning it's highly accessible. You can integrate it into your external system regardless of the origins of your hardware. And there has been a study done about how well a particular web-based platform could be merged into an existing naval vessels. And the last part, and also the most important part, is that there's so many potential contributions that those MDA initiatives could bring to ASEAN countries, right? Because when it integrated, when all of the database sources can be integrated into just one-stop shop, then ASEAN countries or user in general can enhance your capability in terms of monitoring vessels on the ground, and not just vessel, but also accident, potentials of collisions, transnational crime, to prevent collisions from happening, especially in the South China Sea, where the traffic is getting busier and busier, right? And other than that, MDA capability could potentially in the future be integrated with newer sources of information that allow us to dig deeper in newer domains, such as under the water, such as above the water, help us find new resources for offshore development, for renewable energies, and especially to keep track on sea level rise and how it affects us. Because truth be told, Southeast Asian countries, ASEAN countries are always in the list of top 50 IU fishing problems countries, top 10 climate change vulnerable countries, so on and so forth. And also enhancing our own capability in terms of MDA also means that you can master new knowledge on how to use AI or floating devices, unmanned vehicles in the future. So these are the technologies, right, of tomorrow. So managing it, knowing how to use it, could be a great bonus for the ASEAN. And then the last one, MDAs, those MDA programs can help boost the cooperations or coordinations, not just among ASEAN members or users, but also among different agencies within one country as well. I could cite an example of the Vietnam cases where we have a lot of unit on the ground observing what's going on in the sea at the same time, but different units were using different internal database. But then when being introduced with a particular MDA sharing platform, their works are more well connected, and also they have a bonus, an additional reference to track the vessels that need to be tracked. And I will skip that because this is what I just said. And then the last one is, so how do ASEAN take advantage of all of the contributions while limiting the potential hindrance that these MDA initiatives can bring? So I have two sets of suggestions. The first one is a suggestions for the country that offer those MDA initiatives, which mean the EU, the Quad, Canada, so on and so forth, right? I think there should be a better effort in terms of communications, in terms of messaging, because when the initiatives are announced, there's not much information, especially technical information, that is released with it. So people will be left questioning, oh, so what will be our exact duty when we join your MDA initiative? Will we have to contribute our data source, or can we just access your data source? Do you keep track on our record or activities on your MDA websites? Things like that. So if there can be a clearer pictures on how this MDA initiative operates, and if the messaging can be centered on promoting MDA and information capability as a public goods for the ASEAN, not as an effort to target or counter a specific someone, then that would be much better embraced. And in terms of the operational size of those MDA initiatives, I would like to see not just MDA, but a categorized, advanced, and coordinated MDA. What do I mean by that? So categorized meaning that there should be a clear distinctions between strategic and confidential informations and tactical open source informations. So if I am a country and I want to join a particular MDA initiative, I can choose to share or to access the tactical and open information part. And I can still choose to retain the strategic and confidential part of myself. And for coordinated, it means that, as you can see, there's a lot of them knocking on ASEAN doors, right? And a lot of them share similarity in terms of features and functions. So the question is, maybe before turning into the ASEAN, you should find a way to coordinate your effort, maybe to not develop 5 different web-based tool, but merge them into one. Find a way to merge the sources and merge the platform so that it's easier for us to use and to avoid functional confusions and overlapping. And then the last one, advanced MDA. So MDA right now, it just, from what I know, the training or the talk on MDA, the sharing on MDA right now are still at the very initial phase, which is, here's what's going on the ground. Here's how to track the vessel. Here's how to find this and that. But then what? So I would like to see a more analytical capability that could be integrated into such MDA effort, not just how to find a ship, not just how to track a source, but what to deal with it afterward, what to read from the part, and how to analyze hydrological or geographical changes because of sea level rise, things like that. And then the last part, I forgot what the last part is. Okay, yeah, the last part is for the participations, right? When you offer your MDA initiative, maybe to ASEAN, the best way forward is to be inclusive and consent-based, right? So right now, there's only a certain members of ASEAN being approached. How about the rest? So being inclusive could also reduce the sensitivity around such efforts. And the second set of suggestions would be aimed at the ASEAN itself, right, as a potential beneficiaries or potential partners. I feel like the ASEAN can move past the sensitivity around the term MDA. If it's deemed too westernized, maybe we can come up with an alternative, but the substantials should remain the same because we do need that kind of capacity. And I have seen alternative wording such as informational sharing capability or maritime information capability. So there's many other ways to navigate the term MDA. And then the second part is that ASEAN in the future should not just be the recipients of MDA initiative, but could be a potential hub to connect all of the MDA partners and even enlarge the scope of participations. And I would really like to echo some of the ideas that have been mentioned in the morning, that we could use the existing platforms such as the ADMM Plus or the extended ASEAN Maritime Forum. We can use all of the connections that we already have to turn ASEAN into an MDA hub. And the last one is a hub is not complete without the participations of Track 1.5, like what we are doing here today, right? We need universities, we need think tanks, we need research academias, we need students to work on how MDA affects you, how MDA could potentially helps you deal with maritime challenges, and what can we move on from that. And I feel like if the ASEAN can do all of those things, maybe MDA or informational linkages, connectivities could be one way to operationalize the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, especially when the ASEAN outlook has already had two parts on maritime and connectivities. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentations. And any comments or suggestions or questions would be highly appreciated. Thank you so much. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoang from Vietnam. I think your speech is quite interesting, because I mean, actually, Mr. Hoang is an expert on 1.5 diplomacy, or diplomacy initiative. And actually he is using the AI, artificial intelligence, and also the MDA initiative, yeah, which is still very initial levels, yeah, and how to to use that initiative, yeah, I mean to exchange of informations, yeah, related to the geographical changes in the area, and also meteorological changes in the area. So I mean we can prevent the this is not related to conflict, but also to the natural disasters, related to the national disaster relief. Is it true? Yeah. Unconventional maritime thing. Okay, thank you. So I mean the three speakers already presented their views, and now we come to the Q&A, and please, I mean, not only mention your name and also countries, but also please make a very short sentence. Yeah, I mean, without any because usually in particular ASEAN countries, yeah, in particular again Indonesian, usually I mean before they ask their questions, they raise their question. I mean they initiated with the history or something like that. Yeah. So please, I mean, raise your hand. Yes, please. Yes, please. You're the first person. Yes, please.
Thank you so much indeed for this time. As I mentioned from the beginning, the presentation really strengthened our idea and amplify our perspective. I a little bit concerned about the initiatives of MDA. When we are talking about solidity for ASEAN, of course, sometimes we think that the unity is very important for the common perspective. However, when we come to the national interests, whether vital interests, important interests, marginal interests, or even survival interests. So, of course, that's unintentionally and intentionally, or perhaps directly or indirectly, will be different. That's something that we couldn't avoid for their purpose. So dealing with the initiatives of MDA that you mentioned before, there are many advantages and disadvantages, of course. So how can you measure that the initiative should be implemented, should be accepted if blah, 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 blah in that country? Or the initiative of MDA should be ignored because of the country has the condition blah, 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 blah. So from that measurement, we can count how many countries in the ASEAN that have the common perception. Of course, in this case, we couldn't say that ASEAN will have only one perception, single perception. I don't think so. So that's why I really need, and please explore in detail what is actually the measurement in that case. Thank you so much indeed.
Thank you. So you can answer, yes. But
I thought that we will be gathering 3 questions like session 1. Have a little more time to buy. Thank you for the great questions. I do agree that there should be a criteria to assess each of the MDA initiative, and the criteria could be different among ASEAN members, right? And then the criteria could also for the offering countries and also for the offered countries. That is something that I do agree. And actually in the presentations, I did mention some of the criteria that I think the offering countries and the offered countries should have, such as the offering should be aiming at inclusive participations, such as it could, the second one is transparent in terms of communications about the technicality, functional of it, and transparent about the usage of it. So, and then the third, it has to be compatible, right? And coordinated, because right now they are still a little bit separated. There are so many efforts going on at once with overlapping content. So sometimes we don't know which one to choose. So these criteria could be the beginning. And from that, dialogues and exchanges and communications and research are always, and trial and errors are always the way forward to detect to come up with a more concrete set of criteria.
So, Brigadier General, don't want to. Do you have any special for him only? Or do you have maybe any? Okay. So we still have plenty of time actually, about 1 hour from now. Is there any question again? Yes, please. Yes.
Sir, Major General Zambroni from Indonesia, Army Headquarters. My question is, Indonesia is not the claimant for the South China Sea conflict. Sir, for the three speakers, what do you want to say how Indonesia should be act on this problem? Thank you.
Who will give the first answer? Yeah, Dr. Lachica, please.
Thank you for that question, General. There's no denying that Indonesia is the regional leader when it comes to ASEAN. And the role of Indonesia is very indispensable to any processes or any program that ASEAN will undertake. In the case of the South China Sea, there is a difference in how Indonesia is dealing it vis-a-vis the different policies that, like for example, the Philippines and Vietnam have been undertaking due to the fact that we are in that particular area and having this direct claim on those areas, which is really different from the side of Indonesia. But in my opinion, in my perspective, I think Indonesia should continue to be a bridge builder when it comes to the issue of the South China Sea by acting as some sort of a negotiator and connecting the perspective of the major powers and the other members of the ASEAN. I think that's very important for Indonesia to do, being the acknowledged regional leader. And I think Indonesia has been doing that role in the many other processes within ASEAN. Thank you.
Brigadier, please.
Hello. I just want to add, I think in addition to being a non-claimant state, which means that Indonesia is very well suited to help to bring together the different parties, given your neutral position. Indonesia today also has very good ties, relationships with the stakeholders. So now the question is, how can you leverage on the very good relationships that you have with the different stakeholders to bring them together to build the consensus, to focus on the win-win solutions. And I think that is something that we have seen Indonesia as a regional leader do very well in recent situations.
Yeah, I would just like to add one more thing, is that international law is always important, and Indonesia is a part of UNCLOS. And in 2020, Indonesia has submitted a note verbal to the United Nations about their positions on the South China Sea issues, and with specific reference to the 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling awards on the South China Sea. So a step like that publicize and keep on strengthening UNCLOS even on diplomatical front, that is well appreciated.
Okay. Yes, please.
Good afternoon, My name is Laura Horta from Timor-Leste. I work for the Council of Ministers. My question is to Brigadier Tan. Sir, when I was a master's degree student and PhD student in your country, I made extensive use of your Safety Library. That's actually where I met my good friend Andy Udajanto. My question is, there's been a lot of mentioning, including during this forum, of the many artificial islands that China is building in the South China Sea. If I'm not mistaken, according to the US Indo-Pacific Command, there are about, of these islands, 22 of these islands have been militarized. However, there's been a lot of debate among experts on the importance of these islands. Some people say that militarily they could be useful, they could be very disruptive, but others say that they are militarily of very little use because the US military knows where these islands are. Obviously, they are islands, they are static. They know what kind of equipment is there. They can monitor the movements. That they're actually a liability rather than a military asset. I know the question deviates a bit from traditional maritime security, but I would like to hear your opinion as a military man. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Well, I was just going to say that I'm an army officer, so I'm not sure whether you want to hear an army officer's view, But I think as a operational military planner, I would say that having the islands there will be an asset to the Chinese if that is their intent. Now, I'm not going to read into their intent because I cannot say for sure what they believe, but I would say that having the military installations there with the airfields and the installations provides them with a forward staging area, right, where they can extend the reach of their forces into the region. It also provides fixed military assets where they can deny people the use of the area. So I read one very interesting article recently. I think it was by an academic, I'm not sure by who. So they were saying that some of these islands were also being built to secure China's access by its submarine fleet into the Pacific Ocean, right? So I would say from an operational military planner's perspective, I certainly see the island more as an asset if that is how China plans to use it, but I cannot speak for certainty because I don't know what the Chinese are thinking of. Does that answer your question?
So, Dr. Lachica, you want to add?
Yes, maybe just a quick comment for that. When a certain army or armed forces would create military installations in some areas, it speaks for itself. What is the purpose for that? You do not just build military installations into somewhere for no reason at all. And as I see it, it's more for strategic power posturing of China in controlling the sea lanes of communications in this area. And we have also to understand that the location of the South China Sea is very crucial for the defense of China's southern territories. So I agree with the general that it's going to be used for the submarine fleet, but at the same time also for the A2AD, should there will be a major conflict in the South China Sea.
Mr. Do?
Yes, I completely agree with Dr. Allen and General Keat. I would just also like to add that the islands, from what, from the island onwards, what you can do with it is also very worth watching, right? And then not just in terms of A2AD strategies, not just in terms of deploying submarine, but from the island, it could provide a facility or a sort of logistical base for other gray zone challenges, militia vessels, and what is happening under the water is usually little known, but could potentially be detrimental. So especially when there's still many unoccupied features in the Spratlys lying around.
Okay. Maybe from the left side, is there any? Yes, please. Gentleman in the first table.
Terrorism from Malaysian Army and National Resident College. I have two questions. The first question is regarding the MDA. When you talk about MDA, this is very initial platform. Rather than we talk about emerging the whole concept, what about joint common operating pictures that we can be acceptable by most of members of ASEAN? Because when you talk about MDA and this sort of cyber platform, it's also touch on very important factors, which is sovereignty. And when the offering come from not among us, that sovereignty become a very crucial factors. How do you see to overcome that problem? First question. Second question is about China have not recognized the arbitrary 2016. Will they recognize our COC? And what about ASEAN standing on the GSI, Global Security Initiative, proposed by China in 2021? What is our direction forward? Thank you very much.
Yes, Mr.
Why not? Thank you. Yes, cyber sovereignty on cyberspace, right? I did mention it in one of the potential concern. I think the best way to overcome it is still communications, and that communication should happen at a multilateral platform such as the ASEAN. And right now there is a United Nations working group working on building cyber norms, and they have put out 11 norms so far, and they are still debating about cyber sovereignty. But this is the starting point. Maybe the ASEAN could have a ASEAN secretariat on cyber just to communicate, not just in ASEAN platform, but also when the ASEAN representative go to New York for the cyber working group. I also think that, yes, it's true that different countries might have different views on cyber sovereignty, and MDA, as I said, should make a clear distinctions on what is shareable and what is not shareable to maintain that no matter what your ideas of sovereignties on cyberspace is, it can still be adopted, it could be accommodated somehow. I know that it sounds a little bit idealistic, but I believe in process.
Yes, Bijitan.
I think on the second question on whether China will recognize the COC, well, I guess that's the whole purpose of the negotiations right now. What I do think is an important ingredient for the COC to succeed is that ASEAN as a grouping must take a united position on the COC. I remember the time where the ASEAN foreign ministers failed to issue a joint communique for the first time, right? So if ASEAN cannot get our act together, I think let's not talk about whether other people will follow the COC. But I do believe that if ASEAN can get our act together and stay united as a body, then we have a higher chance that the COC will succeed.
Maybe to add to what General has said, although China has not recognized the 2016 arbitral ruling, but when it comes to the COC, will China recognize the COC? That's $1 million question, because until now we are still negotiating on what would be the form, the final form of the code of conduct that would be acceptable both to ASEAN and China. And we are facing stumbling blocks to that because of the different demands and different wants of both China and ASEAN. And I think I agree with what the General has said. The key here is ASEAN unity on how we push forward on the terms that would be acceptable to China as well. So I think in this issue about the code of conduct on the South China Sea, it's very important that we project an image of unity. Otherwise, China would have the upper hand. We cannot afford China to dictate what ASEAN must do in terms of what we wanted to have and to achieve under the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. To your second question about the Global Security Initiative supposedly launched by China, as I see it as a scholar in international relations, ASEAN countries are cautious and wary of such initiative, granting the fact that if we do not have that kind of centrality that we have with, for example, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ADMM plus, then I think ASEAN should veer away from those kind of security initiatives, especially so if ASEAN, if China would take the lead. That has always been the policy of ASEAN ever since. For example, when we started ARF in the 1990s, we made it inclusive with all the other powers in the region because we do not want one single power to monopolize the forum. And I think that's the direction that ASEAN should be doing, especially, of course, with the Global Security Initiative. It is the same thing with the East Asian Summit. If we remember it would happen in Malaysia. And all along, China has been thinking that it's just the three Northeast Asian countries would be invited to join. But then, lo and behold, we invited the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and the other partners, because we wanted to have inclusivity with all the powers that are important to Southeast Asia and to ASEAN. And I think we should be very wary and cautious with that, especially if it is a security initiative, because we do not want to dilute the centrality of ASEAN when it comes to creating security architecture in the Indo-Pacific region.
Is there any questions? Yes, Pak Gubernur.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first one, the theme of this second panel is connectivity. But yet, we can see we are now debating a kind of new maritime defense policy, anti-access area denial. Yeah. Even for Indonesia, anti-access and area denial is now part of our defense policy. So of course, if we implement this anti-access area denial, yeah, it will disrupt again the connectivity in our region. For my colleague from Vietnam, I will very much interested in your opinion how the advancement of the technology, especially artificial intelligence, can better improve our goal to create MDA in our region. Thank you.
Sorry, I had a little bit trouble hearing. But the question is about how AI can improve MDA capability. While AI is a big question, I did bring it up in the presentations as a potential exploration space for the future. But I think once it is researched and examined carefully enough, it could open up a lot of space because essentially MDA is data, right? And data can come from one source or another. And each source will have its own strength and limits. So the more sources that you have, then the lesser the probabilities of limits that you will encounter. So if AI can be that extra one, right now there's AIS, radio frequency, right? Sensor technologies and some of the similar data sources. And if AI can be a part of an extra part and can be connected to the existing platforms such as satellites, such as automatic detection system, then there is a potential positive roles there.
Any other questions? No? Oh, please. Please stand up, Pak. Yeah.
Thank you, Pak Moderator, Ambassador Ikrar. I am Alex from Universitas Pelita Harapan in Indonesia. My question goes to all the speakers. When you look at the trade statistics of all these 10 countries, I think it is not an exaggeration to say that China is their indispensable partner. Not only that, all these 10 countries also depend on China for infrastructure financing and investment. And considering the fact that all these governments are pragmatic, in order to recover from the current pandemic crisis, I think that this economic variable should be included in your policy equation, because that is part of the reality of the interactions between all these small and middle powers in their interactions with China. My question is, to what extent this economic variable affects all the things and all the proposals that you have mentioned in dealing with the maritime security in Southeast Asia, because the nature of this security problem is such that we have to use this, interdisciplinary approach in order to deal with them. It's not only a security issue, but it's always part of the problem to include all these economic variables. Thank you.
Well, Alex, thank you for your question. Well, my view is that it is indeed the economy that is the basis for why we are talking a lot about the importance of the South China Sea. Right? I think Dr. Allen has pointed out at the start of the presentation the importance of the sea trade routes that go through the South China Sea. Right? $3.4 trillion worth of trade. That's the combined GDP of Southeast Asia. If the security there is disrupted, the trade is disrupted, the economic development is disrupted. So I think the whole notion about economy and security being closely linked is a very important one, like you correctly pointed out. Now, there was another question that you pointed out, that you mentioned at the start, which is all the ASEAN countries, right? They have very close economy links with China. And to what extent will these links, will these considerations affect the policy making? Now, I think that's a very broad question that I won't pretend I have the answer for all the countries, but I think it is probably fair and accurate to say that many, if not all the countries, especially in our region, have said in one form or another that increasingly we are being put in a very difficult position of having to walk a tightrope between US and China, of having to choose between them. Right? But we don't want to choose. Right. What we want is a stable and safe region where our countries can continue to grow, can continue to prosper, and all in this region can continue to partake in these developments. Right. Now, if push comes to shove, how every country will choose, I don't think I'll have the answer, but I would say that every country will have to decide not just the economy, not just the security, but all the other instruments, and in their own strategic calculation, what is best for them. But at this point, I don't think any one of us will have a very clear answer that if war breaks out, I will certainly support one country over the other country. But I think that is something that none of us want to be put in their position.
I think to add to that, we could not deny that
the economy is closely interlinked with the security of Southeast Asia and of the South China Sea in general. In fact, the reason why we wanted to avert a military conflict or crisis in the South China Sea, it's all because of economics. Well, we know that what happens there would definitely affect the economies of the entire region. And that's what we are trying to prevent. Hence, we're pushing for a code of conduct in the South China Sea. Because when war or conflict breaks out in the area, everybody loses. China loses, as well as Southeast Asia also will lose. So that's why we are trying to come up with a strategy that would really address to reduce the tension and the conflict in the area. With regards to the 10 Southeast Asian economic relations with China, it's a given fact that China is the #1 trading partner of ASEAN. I think last year, if I'm not mistaken, we traded about $366 billion with China. And China is an economic giant, and it's right there next to us. It's our neighbor. So it's indispensable. It's closely tied with the economic destiny of Southeast Asia. Now, if we are going to choose between China and the United States, I think that's a very broad question which cannot be answered in one specific way, because it really depends on the strategic imperatives of every country, right? So, but then of course we have to realize that the major economies of Southeast Asia are really trading robustly with China. So I think it's a given reality that economically we are more inclined to be associated closer with China. And on the other hand, when it comes to security, many countries in Southeast Asia would look to the United States. And that is, well, of course, we know we have to hedge. We have to make a strategic balancing in order to maintain stability in the region.
I would just say two things. The first one is that from Vietnamese approach, we consider the dispute with China one part of the relationship. So there's other parts that are always there. It doesn't define the whole relationship. The second thing is that, yes, it's true that having some sort of economic interdependency sometimes can put you in a tricky positions, but it's also true the other way around, that you can also use economic interdependencies as a leverage. Because China is our biggest trade partner, right? But then also the other way around, we are also China's big trade partners. Vietnam is the largest trade partners with China in the ASEAN and among the top 10 in the world. So there's leverage, there's room.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, do you have other questions for our speakers today? If you still have questions for speakers today, please kindly raise your hand.
Thank you very much for the time to ask questions. My name is Colonel Rujito. I am from Indonesian Defense University. My question goes to Dr. Alan, and I really enjoy your presentation, and I would like to congratulate all the speakers for your excellent presentation. If I understand your presentation correctly, in the last part of your presentation, you mentioned about how we should develop the code of conduct. And two things that I take note from your presentation. One is about the COC is not only about China and ASEAN member states, but also open to other parties. The second one is, what is the mechanism if there is a potential conflict among states and those who are members of or the signatory of the COC. So my question to you is, how can ASEAN, as the leader of this COC, can maintain its centrality as the, let's use the word major, player of this area? That's all my question. Thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you, sir, for that question. Well, I'm sure my two other colleagues here would also love to answer that question. But with your question, how could ASEAN maintain its centrality, especially when it comes to the negotiation for this code of conduct? I think I would like to reiterate once again that it's very important that ASEAN must take the lead in, especially in crafting of the final outcome of the code of conduct. What we have mentioned earlier, ASEAN unity is very important when it comes to crafting the code of conduct on the South China Sea. And you mentioned about the participation of other powers which are not part of the region. I think ASEAN should really push hard that inclusivity when it comes to non-restriction in the participation of activities in the South China Sea should really be pushed in any part of the COs. Like, for example, as what I mentioned earlier, in the single negotiating draft text for being pushed by China, one of the conditions that China is asking is that military activities could be vetoed by any parties to the COC. And that would, in my opinion, sir, that would be very, very unproductive for all ASEAN members in terms of our defense diplomacy and alliances with other countries and other powers in the region. And I think that's one pitfall that ASEAN should not give in to China's demand. And I think it's really important that ASEAN would come up with a common united stand in order for not to give in to China's demand, and that the COC would be effective and would be working for the benefit of both ASEAN and China, and not just for China. In my opinion, sir, I would say a haphazard and an unacceptable COC would be as dangerous as having no COC at all. Thank you.
Do you have any? Yes, please, Mr. Du.
Yes, and I would completely agree with Dr. Allen that even if the COC is inclusive, the ASEAN is still the main player because we are in the process that's shaping the COC. And sometimes that process by itself is already an outcome. And some of the inclusivity could be about the rise, right? Not the players, but the rise. And the rise are universals, are endorsed in UNCLOS. So it will not take away ASEAN centrality.
We still have about 15 minutes, I think. So is there any question? Yes, please. This is the last question, I think.
Thank you. My name is Ferry. I'm from the Prof. I want in the forum, Jakarta Geopolitical Forum is very interested in discussing it. I would like to ask two questions to the speakers. Namely, is one, number one, what are the views of the countries towards Indonesia at this time regarding the current economic and political situation and its development so that Indonesia is not controlled by the US superpower? Number two, what is the current follow-up to the current political and economic cooperation with China? In what form so that we can contribute to the political and economic condition of US and China tensions and nuclear war in South Korea and the global watch? It is issue in the hot issue is now. Thank you.
you want to?
Maybe to start answering your question with how other countries would view Indonesia, I don't want to comment on the political aspect of Indonesia because I am not an authority to comment on that. But what I can just say is Indonesia has always been the leader for non-aligned countries, especially when it comes to relations with a big power. The non-aligned movement has been historically created through the initiatives of Indonesia and India. So I think up until now, that is the brand of diplomacy that Indonesia has been projecting to the world, which is non-aligned when it comes to siding with any major power. And I think that has quite worked for Indonesia as a middle power. Right? So I think that's the answer to the question.
I think this is the end of our second sessions. I do believe that all of us enjoyed the second sessions, with the presentations of the three speakers, because I mean they have not only their own views, on the security and also prosperity in the South China Sea areas. But also, I think they still, have the common views that ASEAN centrality is still very important for us, in particularly in dealing with China, to prepare for the code of conduct in the South China Sea, because we do not want that one country will dictate our policy, in ASEAN, and also maybe which could break up the ASEAN in the near future. I do believe that the unity in ASEAN is still quite strong, because this is from three countries. For example, Mr. Do is from Vietnam, and BG10 is from Singapore, and also Dr. Lachica is from the Philippines, who is very close to the South China Sea. And please join me to give applause to the three speakers. And thank you very much for your presentations, and also thank you very much for the whole floors, who already be patient, in listening to these presentations. From these three distinguished speakers. Thank you, President.